I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Ilan Stavans. Internationally known as a cultural critic and essayist, he has a new book out that he edited entitled A Nation Wrestles with God: American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. This is a fascinating volume that takes us through the history of how Americans have thought about God, not just as some entity in the sky, but rather as an organizing principle. And it covers the gamut of believers and non-believers, professors and pop stars, and everyone in between. This is a fascinating volume, and I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. But before we get to that, I need to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener funded. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, if you can, support my sponsor, Mike Swanson at wallstreetwindow.com. He's got the best financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips, and his newsletter is free. I think you can even get a free ebook about investing from Mike if you subscribe now. Again, it's free and it's a great financial and trading newsletter. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com and support the work of Mike Swanson. And with that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Ilan Stavans. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very, very happy to be speaking with. It took some time to get this interview together, but I'm really happy to be doing it. I'm speaking with Ilan Stavans, who has edited a very interesting volume that I think everyone should pick up. A Nation Wrestles with God: American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. How are you doing, Ilan?
I'm doing very well and very excited to be talking to you.
So I want to start with the title. This is not, you could have called it something like One Nation Under God, musings on God and religion, but you didn't call it that. You called it A Nation Wrestles with God: American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. And I think that title is actually very, it's specific. It's meant to evoke something. And I think it was very well chosen. Can you talk about the title and why it's A Nation Wrestles with God as opposed to something like One Nation Under God or something like that?
Terrific question. Just by way of starting my answer, it is when a title comes to my head that I have the book. I can see what is going to be filled with. But the process of finding that title is sometimes burdensome and sometimes takes me in some circuitous ways. I had from the very beginning this notion that it would be A Nation Wrestles with God for a couple of reasons. The first one is that one of the most emblematic and favorite episodes in the Bible to me as a story is the one where Jacob is wrestling with an angel. And it is at that point that his name is changed to Israel, and the wrestling decides what is going to be internally and externally his own connection with the divine. And I wanted to use that image of a higher force making you shape your views on how to understand the spiritual forces that surround us, but not in an individual way. On the contrary, I wanted to do it in a national way. What is it that makes Americans struggle with the concept of the divine from before this country became a republic in 1776 to the present? And how have all these components changed? How have we as a nation changed in the process of defining who and what God is? And how does God change as God looks at us trying to figure out how we relate to that big entity.
One of the first sort of characters you mentioned wrestling with God is actually a fictional character. You talk about Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
So the Mark Twain book. And I thought that was an interesting way to start because it kind of indicates that even those who are unbelievers or doubting Thomases or whatever we want to call them wrestle with God. So this is not a book just about how the religious wrestle with God. Can you talk about why you included that mention and analysis of Huckleberry Finn?
Yes, again, I am just delighted to be exploring these topics with you, JG. For me, the most enigmatic, the most symbolic, the most resonant of literary characters in the American literary tradition is Huck. Huck and his friend Jim, but Huck, this little boy who is traversing the Mississippi with a runaway slave, running away himself from an abusive alcoholic father, from a society that is bankrupt, that can't figure out how to address and approach people that have different color skins. And this is a boy that did not grow up in a religious home. Instead, is trying to figure out morality on his own in those adventures that he takes. I think that the history of the United States is all of us sitting next to Huck, all of us being in that raft, trying to understand how to relate to adults, how to grow up as children. I think America is kind of eternally trapped in being a child, wanting desperately to become an adult. And the beauty of that novel, and I can't think of a more significant novel, Hemingway once said that all American fiction begins and ends in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is that Huck is really a traveler who doesn't have a single answer to this question. Who is God? What role do I have? How do I understand morality connected with God? But instead questions the existence of God and questions the doubt of what is good and what is evil. And as a little child, we're already learning these enormous lessons from him. So I thought there's no better place to start this book than taking a lesson from Huck.
I also wanted to ask you, for my listeners, I feel like this is not primarily a book about religion. And that may sound weird at first to some people, but I think it's a book about religion and faith and unbelief as like an organizing question. You know, it organizes the way we think and how we sort of interpret the world. Am I on the right track there,
You're
or?
absolutely on the right track. I think that what religion does in America and what God does in America is organize us as a society, give us some railings. And this is not a book for believers. In fact, the believers might be surprised by the amount of skeptics and atheists and agnostics in the book, who to me are as important as anybody who believes truthfully, loyally, and eternally in God. I think that the mess, the contradictions, the plurality of voices that we all have in relationship with religion is what defines us as Americans. And particularly in the last 50, 75 years, with immigration coming from parts of the world that are not Europe, where religion tends to be more or less homogeneous, I think we are a very complicated nation with many different gods, with many different views of spirituality. Can we really call ourselves a nation? Can we listen to others that have different opinions?
Do you want to talk in that regard about how the chapter right after the introduction, or the first piece that you include at the beginning, is the night chant from the
Yeah.
Navajo Nation? I thought that was a very interesting inclusion because you're not starting it with like the Christian faith. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. For starters, those that are coming with the Christian faith from abroad did not come to a tabula rasa, to a place that did not have a sense of spirituality, that did not understand the divine. But on the contrary, there were natives here who had a very sophisticated, very different view of the divine, and a view that is that has to do with a higher, it's not institutional in the way we see Catholicism, Islam, Judaism. It's connected with nature. It's connected with our own improvement, with how we tell the stories of ourselves. And for me, it was crucial to start with chants, hymns, and other types of songs that Native Americans, indigenous people in this country, have been using to communicate with higher powers, to bring rain, to bring harvest, to bring love, to bring procreation. That is as central to our religious experience as Americans as going to church every Sunday or to synagogue and mosque other days of the week.
Now, what's really interesting is perhaps, and if you don't want to explore this that much, that's fine, but I think it is interesting, your own sort of personal position on matters of faith, because you actually say on some days you're an inveterate skeptic and on other days you're a believer. So maybe you can
Absolutely.
stake out your position. It sounds like you sort of let things flow a little bit.
I think I am myself a wrestler or a struggler when it comes to the divine. I could not hide behind all the entries of different people in this book. I wanted myself to be right there. I am an immigrant from Mexico, JG, who came to the United States in the mid 80s. I grew up in an enclave of Jews, poor Jews that had escaped Eastern Europe and wanted to come to the United States, but immigration quotas made it impossible, ended in different parts of the Caribbean, and my family, particularly in Mexico. On the one side, one parent, my father, was an absolute skeptic, couldn't care less about religion. What he was interested in is the act and art of storytelling. He was an actor, and believed that we find meaning in stories. And my mother had come from a religious background, but had eloped with my father. The marriage was not embraced by my mother's parents. And eventually, those parents reconciled with my father, but it was my mother's devotion, her running away, and eventually coming back in her own terms to religion that really defined me. So I am a person who places rationality center stage, but who in many ways envies those that are true believers without any degree of doubt and skepticism, because I can't have that. I am always doubting the dogma or the faith that exists. So I thought I would be, I'm hoping, the right person to edit this book, because I both can sit next to those that are fully devout and to those that believe that God is a concoction, an invention that just makes us feel good for temporarily.
I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier. I think when people hear the term God, they may think of the old white man in the sky with a beard or something. But you sort of want to look at it as God is like this social principle or something that provides moral framework, or it's a response or a way to alleviate our sort of existential angst and anxieties. How do you explain that to people? Because I think so many people are used to looking at the question of God as a question related to an entity of sorts.
Yeah, I think that God, at whatever time and in whatever nation, is a response to the impossible and frightening solitude that we have as humans that are conscious of our beginning and our end, and that know that at some point we're no longer going to be here. Where are we going? Why were we set in here? What is it what task was given to us to perform here, if anything? And in humankind, we have gone to thinking of God as a kind of puppeteer that decides the fate of everybody and writes the story even before we live. We embody that story. And those who think that, no, we live in a free-for-all universe, nothing serves us as a container or a railing, and we have to come up with some antidotes to that fear and anxiety in order to be able to exist. I think that simply turning God into a palliative or a medicine is too simplistic. On the other hand, canceling the possibility of logic and reason, and thinking that God is going to do everything for us is equally extreme or ridiculous. To me, the finding of God is in the questioning of God, is in the wrestling, in the doubts that we have. The more doubts, the closer we are with a higher force and with other people that also connect with that higher force.
What do you mean specifically when you say you write that God is an organizing principle? What do you mean by an organizing social principle?
Yeah. I mean that religion, though today you can have morality, JG, without a force that is God. You can have good and evil, and nobody's going to punish you by going to hell or to heaven. That was the origin of the idea of good and evil, that at some point there was going to be this reward and this punishment for your behavior in this world. We have given up, or at least secular, advanced, technologically, scientific society has given up on this post-death experience, and we can have the good and the bad here. But I think that ultimately what God does and what religion does is that it helps us coalesce as groups and have a common series of principles, a common series of questions that are answered and that push us forward and that glue us together, either in families or in communities or in nations. And I am, as an immigrant, always surprised by the frequency with which God is invoked in politicians' speeches. Always they ended with God bless America, or we have had as the motto of this country, in God we trust. We're always invoking God in one way or the other. It seems to me that kind of gives us a sense of being protected by a higher force or being on the right side of things.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because one of the characters that I don't think he comes up in the book at all, but I was thinking about H.L. Mencken while reading this because I thought about how I've read a lot of Mencken even when I was younger. I just found him an interesting writer, even though he was from an era way before mine. But he was like the ultimate atheist, right? You know, the ultimate one of the ultimate journalists covering the Scopes monkey trial, which you do cover in the book. Who was just completely an unbeliever. But even he actually, in his writing, uses the imagery of God and the devil. He often invokes them, usually to a satirical effect. But it's interesting to me because even a hardcore atheist like that will invoke the imagery of God, the imagery of the devil, the imagery of religion.
Yeah, I I'm grateful to you because I don't find many people with whom to talk about Mencken. And I am a big Mencken devotee. I don't know, he's not God, but he is a big role model for me. A man of incredible verbal power that covered so many different topics, and particularly the topic of how the English language changes and all the folklore that comes to it. And he was attuned and alert to how English was being transformed by the Norwegians and by the Jews and the Italians and the Irish and everybody that was coming in and becoming much more expansive, but not only the language, also the imagery of what it means to be an American, the good and the bad, the tense and the relaxed. And I love reading Mencken, even when I am absolutely against his conclusions. It's the type of writer that makes me think a lot. But look, I want to tell you a story that I think it proves your point. And that is that even, if I understand it right, that even those that are atheists or agnostics at some point will say, oh, let me revert at least temporarily, at least as a joke in God, in order to feel more comfortable, or maybe some more empathetic to the person in front of us. There is a piece, JG, in the book written by Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor from Auschwitz, the Holocaust, and it's not one of his most famous ones, but to me it's one of the most enduring ones. It's a play, for one thing. He mostly wrote stories and memoirs and novels, including Night, about his experience itself in Auschwitz. And this is the story in this play of, in Auschwitz, in the barracks, just as death is knocking at the door, the prisoners, all Jews, decide to put God on trial one night. And there's going to be the prosecutors and there's going to be the defense, and they bring all the arguments in favor of believing in God, even in this most extreme of circumstances. And then on the other side, it's the argument that God doesn't exist, that look what we've reached and we have been forgotten. And it comes the moment where the verdict has to be established, and lo and behold, God is found guilty of abandoning God's own creations. And guess what all the prisoners in favor against do? They all begin to pray. In spite of everything, it is in that moment when they realize that they themselves have condemned God. Even the skeptics who begin thinking, but what if? What if there is a God after all this? And that prayer to me is one of the most chilling notes in the history of Jewish literature and the history of the literature that Elie Wiesel himself wrote.
Yeah, again, it's very interesting because believer or skeptic, faithful or faithless, we all seem to wrestle with just the way God is deeply embedded, or faith is deeply embedded into our experience as Americans.
Absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. And for that reason, the book has all kinds of voices. And I think one of the reasons I don't know if it would be appropriate, but I kind of make that suggestion to offer a history of God, because God is supposed to be absolute, omnipresent, omnipotent, ubiquitous. So a history of God would mean that God gets changed, that there's all kinds of nuances. But I think that one of the beauties of the history of the United States is that every generation comes along with a different version of God, with one that adapts to what it needs. And we're witnessing it right now between the Pope, the first American in the Vatican to lead the Catholic Church, and the president and vice president. And one side says that God is a pacifist. The other one says that God is a bellicose entity that wants to always be in a fight. And, they're both Americans. And I think it shows you how we project onto God the reasons we want to do certain things at a particular time.
Now, I recall in the intro, and I haven't been able to pull up the exact quote, but I think you talk at one point in the introduction about gathering different writings from different writers, and you have to get permissions to do these. And you had one person who goes unnamed that says, I appreciate it, but I think God is the worst thing to have happened to our national discourse. So, but it raises an interesting question. You said the person says something along those lines. I can't remember the exact quote, but I guess it does lead to the question of why. Why should we be talking about God and faith and how we wrestle with faith?
Well, I think that that question of why is, I would twist it a little bit and say, do we ever not talk about God, even when we are talking about soccer or we're talking about the tacos that we had that night? Ultimately, it's the question of freedom. Are we here because of ourselves and we choose every act and action we perform, or everything that we do has already been preordained and magically laid out, mapped out by a higher force that decides? There's a beautiful novella in the form of dialogue written in France in the 18th century. It's a servant and his master, and the master is convinced that everything, you make a step, but the step was already written, whereas the servant is saying, no, it's your step. Nobody tells you to do that. I think we have the master and the servant all inside us. It's true, JG, when you put together an anthology like this, you have to go out. I mean, the editor has to go out and ask either the living authors, if they would like to be part of this, and you would be honored to have them there, or their estates, or their agents and all that, bureaucratic army that people have next to them, or if they are dead and it's in the, it's in the common domain, then you just use the piece and do it responsibly. But there have been people who did, well, there have been many responses, and I wish I could put together only a book of the responses that people gave me. One is like the one you said, I would never participate in such a book. God has been the most destructive idea since the beginning of time. And we would be good to stop talking about God, to ignore God, and to finally be free. That would be full and complete freedom. And the other one is Trump. People said, if I would love to be in the book, but if you put Donald Trump over there, then I don't want to be there because I would be in conversation and I can't stand that man. So you have to kind of satisfy everybody's expectations and you try to convince them. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. I would say 98% of the time people say yes, but there's always the responses that are better than the entry that you originally tried to put in. And that person did not allow me to use that, so I used it anonymously, not so as not to call attention to their rejection of being part of an anthology where God is centerpiece.
If we could, I wanted to talk about how scientists and even secular-minded people look at the question of God, of faith, because you delve into it pretty deep with various different voices, including some that are included, like Stephen Jay Gould, who I'm a big fan of. But on one hand, there's Stephen Jay Gould who would say, well, we're asking different questions, the religious and the scientific. There's others that would say, well, there's no use to religion at all. This is all hokum and nonsense. What do you make of the different voices? And I think there's also Francis Collins, who's a
Francis
scientist.
Collins, yes, and Einstein is in the book as well. Einstein as an immigrant. Yeah.
But Francis Collins, I think, is he's a believer, after doing
I
all this
find
work on
it,
genetics.
to me, some of the most interesting cases, or at least some of the cases that are closer to me, are the ones of scientists or philosophers or rationalists who at some point concede that that they themselves are deep believers, not in an institutional God that makes them do certain prayers and rituals, but in a higher idea. Einstein, when he reached the extremes of his theory of relativity and his second theory and his visions of time and space, concluded that even beyond all that, there has to be some central force, and a force that might be playing the die in front of us. Darwin, in the very last chapter of The Origin of Species, after having spelled out all this incredible and detailed information about the evolution of different species and how they leap at certain points and create their own paths, the very last chapter is a confession that maybe the very, very first igniting moment is a moment of a godlike fixture or feature that pushes things to start in the process that they will ultimately come. He didn't have to include that. He could have ended the book without that. And yet those scientists are devout believers in a higher force, even as they themselves have had to prove the lack of existence of that force. And I love seeing Gould kind of going back and forth between, yes, this is without a God, and no, I think God is at the center. And one of the pieces
he called
that I
it
like
the non-overlapping,
right?
Was it magisteria? Yeah,
Magisteria, and I think it's a beautiful and beautifully complex piece by Stephen Jay Gould that I think shows you the different types of voices that you get here. Voices of people who are very methodical and voices of people who are just spiritual wanderers.
I mentioned people who are skeptical of God within the scientific world, but even with you mentioned Carl Sagan at one point in the book. Even with Sagan, there is this, he may not be talking about God, but he is talking about this sense of awe that he finds in the natural world. Do you think, in a weird way, that even the atheists are talking about something, if not God, they're talking about the sublime at times without even
Abs-
invoking God?
100%, absolutely. I think that awe, that reverence, that sense of wonder. At one point, I had Carl Sagan in the book, and I think that the book was too big, and the publisher said we have to shorten it. I love that sense of wonder. I love what science fiction writers do with God, the explorations. I love what children's book authors do with God as well. It is a quest to recognize that even when this old idea of the white bearded man that is supposed to be controlling everything feels dated, in fact, we still retain the sense of childhood wonder about why we're here and how things work or don't work. And especially as the world becomes even more complicated, let's remember that every generation has more words at its disposal to describe a world that is more complex than the one of the previous generation and those that came before. That we could have done, even after the Middle Ages too, away with this concept of God as a ruling principle. And yet, in the most secular, most rationalistic and scientific moments, Newton and Einstein and Galileo all in one way or another invoked God, even if they were going against the church and against dogmas in different ways. We all inevitably have this sense of reverence of how small specks of dust we are and how big the design of all this outside of remains.
One figure I wanted to talk about, and I've been avoiding talking about, I don't want to talk about each little entry. I want people to discover it on their own. But there is one person you included that I wanted to talk about, which is Christopher Hitchens, because even the section is from his book God Is Not Great. It's so interesting because he is this, he's the atheist's atheist. He's confronting God head on. And I think it's interesting that he's included in the book, because you could have picked any number of different atheist voices, a Sam Harris or a Richard Dawkins, but Christopher Hitchens really stands out. And I think he's a fascinating figure, especially when you compare and contrast him to his brother, Peter, who they used to argue about religion. And sometimes I agree with Peter on some things, and sometimes I agree with Christopher. It's like watching them wrestle with God is really interesting. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the inclusion of Christopher Hitchens in the book.
Oh, absolutely. And I will tell you also a little secret in answering your question. I find his feistiness and his astonishing capacity to articulate complex thoughts in a way that can be understood and related by a vast number of people simply admirable. And even when, and this happened often, I absolutely disagreed with him, I did it with reverence and admiration because of how he had built those arguments. It is not what he concluded, but how he had presented them that to me felt so strong. And that book, God Is Not Great, is perfect proof of this. This is a man who had wrestled with the idea, who had been given a formal education. In school, he had received visions or lessons on God, and then he had run away, become a lefty, rebelled, and ultimately wrote this book saying, God is not great, and look what God does. September 11, extremism from left and right, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And in preparing all the headnotes, I tried to be as neutral as possible and not interfere. I don't want readers to know what I think about a particular entry. I want to give them the basic information and propose certain key things to keep in mind as they start reading the piece. But I couldn't avoid at the very end of the headnote that introduces Hitchens to quote a little reaction to God Is Not Great I think it was an Amazon reader, reader, or somewhere else where that reader said, "And you are not great either, Mr. Hitchens." So to me, that was a kind of leveling of, okay, is for certain readers, maybe Hitchens is saying, God is not great because I, Christopher Hitchens, I'm so great. But this is a way of bringing us all back to reality where we can still clash with our siblings or with our readers.
I also wanted to ask you, you teed me up for it earlier and I didn't take the opportunity to delve more into it, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of reactions to the inclusion of Donald Trump, and it's his remarks from the Capitol National Prayer Breakfast. Why did you think it was important to include that?
I think that Donald Trump is, for better or worse, a figure that has thoroughly and permanently reconfigured what America is. I think Donald Trump will be seen both as a hero and as the ultimate destroyer of the American dream, depending on where people sit. And there is no, on the one hand, bigger charlatan when it comes to religion than Donald Trump. He can pretend to be a Catholic devout in order to get votes. And he leaves that speech and goes and starts drinking or starts having a conversation exactly about the opposite. So for me, Donald Trump represents maybe a repellent but central way of certain Americans to approach God in a convenient fashion, depending on the circumstance. And he's the elephant in the room for better or worse again, and not including him there with his abrasive language, with his abuses of grammar, I think would leave the book with a black hole in the middle of it.
I also wanted to ask, with regards to the way you organized the book, you could have organized this a number of different ways, right? You could have had a section for pre-Christian beliefs in America and a bunch of different pieces. You could have organized it by the date that the piece was written. I think the way you've chosen to organize it is based on oldest uh, writer or speaker to the youngest voices. You know, can you speak about why you organized in that specific way? Was that very intentional on your part?
Absolutely intentional. I wanted to not to ghettoize or segregate writers according to themes or to epochs. I think epochs, even the idea of a century or the idea of a year is an artificial one. I mean, we're all using a human invented categories to say that today is Monday, but it could be Thursday, and today is June, but it could be December, depending on those conventions that we use. And I wanted to give a sense, not to force that sense, but to offer the reader the capacity to see that evolution that we have had as a nation of different approaches to God outside of the forced scholarly debates of all these people belong to this group and all these people. To me, scholars can be, and I'm one of them, very important to dig out and understand larger questions, to phrase them, but not to digest thought. I think it's important that the reader comes up with their own conclusion and they make the connections. An anthology like this is suggesting that we're all part of a symphony of voices that communicates the violins with the strings, with the different types of instruments. And that connection will depend on who's listening and where you're positioned in the auditorium, etc. There's another part that for me is very intentional. I don't like books that say this is only fiction, or this is only poetry, or this is only scientific papers or cartoons. The world is messy. The world is chaotic. And that mess and that chaos are beautiful and should be replicated. Somebody can do wonders in a poem, and somebody can do wonders in a cartoon, and the reader will find them wherever that fit in the chronology of things.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that chronology because, I mean, for instance, you could have done something where you have a section for the transcendentalists. So you
Yeah.
have Emerson, Thoreau, etc. But you didn't do it that way. You
Right.
had it sort of be each speaker and they're based on how old they are and their birth date. And I think that's more interesting because it shows you the evolution
Right.
of how we talk about God and who gets to talk about God. Because, you start out with a figure early on like Cotton Mather. He's a
Yeah.
minister, so he has a right to speak about this. But then you get down to today, and you're seeing Lana Del Rey
Right.
speaks about it. There's been a democratization, and you can see that just in the way it's organized.
That is the real message of the book. That's the real message. It's not the theologians alone. It's not the professors. It's not the highbrow elites that should be listened to. It's everybody, the musicians and the playwrights and the average person who can say something incredibly eloquent.
How did you how important was it for you to include the sort of pop culture element? Like Lana Del Rey, I thought that really is going to stick out to some people, but I think it was a necessary inclusion.
Yeah, maybe I'm a child of a certain period, but I think that the artificial division between highbrow and pop culture has been utterly debunked. There is no
Amen.
need, no need to even talk about it in any serious way. And I think great and very eloquent and lasting reflections on God and philosophy can come on in cartoon form on Saturday mornings in one of the episodes of SpongeBob, or they can come in a song by Bob Dylan or Lana Del Rey or whoever. I think you can find it as you turn the channels or as you open the funnies in the newspaper. It is not, we no longer live where the book is the deliverer of the truth. Now truth can be found anywhere and everywhere. That democratizing can create lots of confusions. Now everybody has a voice and everybody wants to be heard, and everybody feels we all feel we are at the same level. That's really good. It's, in a country of 335 or 340 million people, everybody has to be heard at the same time, screaming to one another. It can be challenging, but this is the world in which we live.
I wanted to ask specifically, so you include voices from across different religions, and I come from a background, so I grew up Catholic. And I found some of the Catholic voices that you included to be very interesting because they can be very different from one another in a lot of ways. So you can go from like Father Coughlin to what my favorite, and I'm so glad you included her, was Dorothy Day. Can
Yes.
you talk about how you decided to include different voices, whether it was Catholic or whether it was Jewish, etc.?
Yeah, for me, that was really the most important challenge as an editor. I wanted to bring in the many different religions that we have. And of course, some religions are more prominent than others because of the number of followers, because of the traditions that they have, because of the influence. But I didn't want to give either the official or only one side of that religion. I wanted to create the tension that exists between different voices within Catholicism, without Judaism. In terms of Judaism, there are those that are Reform and are Reconstructionist and are Orthodox. And I wanted the reader to have to decide, because ultimately, what an anthology of this kind does is offer the possibilities of people pursuing some of these entries and going further on their own and seeing what Dorothy Day said in other articles that she wrote, or Cesar Chavez, or James Baldwin. So I think it's within that, the crucial part of the anthologies is which piece by Dorothy Day are you going to include? In which piece by Father Laughlin? It's a central question that you have to find something that feels fresh, that can provoke people, maybe annoy people and infuriate certain people, but ultimately will be in conversation with the other pieces in the book. And this brings me, if I may, To another point that was central in the task of putting this anthology together, and I try to convey it in my intro. In a country where we pray as Jews and where we pray as Catholics or where we pray as whatever other Muslims, etc., are we all praying to the same God, whoever is praying, or is this the Catholic God that is different from the Jewish God? And if that is the case, then we don't have one God. We have the different gods competing with one another, a kind of Greek mythology here of competition between Zeus and Minerva and other semi-human characters. So to me, the central question of the book is America bargaining, wrestling, negotiating, struggling with one entity that loves and populates all these different religions? Or is it that each religion is relativistic? None of them can claim a single approach to the truth, which has been the history of humankind. And can we live with that? It's not an easy realization.
Real quick on the reason I mentioned Father Coughlin specifically was it ever hard including people that you may have found abhorrent? Yes.
Yes.
And why do you, I feel like you still feel like they need to be included.
Absolutely, they need to be included. And I fought tooth and nail with the permissions person and with people in the staff. You cannot only include the people that you like in the anthology. Religion has been used in all kinds of ways, in very destructive ways, in abhorrent, violent, bloody ways, and it has been also inspiring. And if you're only going to be putting the beautiful, inspiring side, this is not the God of this country. The God of this country is a bellicose, offensive, fearmonger that does all kinds of, but it can also be the one that brings you in love with the trees, and the ones that provokes the idea that we might be peaceful. I wanted the book to include the terrible voices, but have been very influential, and the sublime voices, the very well written pieces, and the pieces who forget about the quality of writing because they are so concerned with venom and aggression. But all that is the religion of America.
In terms of the literary voices you include, it's a very fascinating mix. I'm just looking over the contents right now. You can end up going from Flannery O'Connor to Philip K. Dick, the sci-fi author, to Philip Roth, to Susan Sontag. How do you figure out which specific literary voices to get in there? Because you include politicians, you include pop singers, you include Stephen Colbert comedians. How did you choose those sort of literary voices that come into play?
I wanted to do, for me, the literary voices, because I love literature, and for me, literature is a religion, is the religion of using the word to try to map out the universe in the best possible way, according to the time and place in which you live. I wanted to bring in those beautiful pieces, again, some pieces that might not be of my own religious views or my own religious opinions, but that have had an influence on America at that specific time. James Baldwin, for instance, with struggling with the tyrannical figure of his father and trying to figure out how he loves this country in spite of the slavery and in spite of the abuses that the white majority have. Or the Philip Roth piece, that is an early piece by him of a little boy who is going to a Hebrew school and in a discussion with one of his friends, decides to run into the roof, and he's going to throw himself down and commit suicide if the rabbi doesn't knee and say that Jesus was a real person and that he was born not as a human, but from a miracle. And the rabbi refuses. So some of them are blasphemous pieces, heretical pieces, as writers often end up being. I wanted that heresy and that blasphemy beautifully conveyed to be in the book, because that is what we have been reading and writing about. The questions of, is it possible that we have a God that is oppressing us, or is it possible that we have a God that is sending us to a place that is better than where we are? How to see all this confusion?
Since I mentioned the Flannery O'Connor piece, that was an interesting one since I believe it's the entirety of the short story of
It's
Revelation.
complete. Yeah,
Okay.
it's complete.
That's one of so how do you pick between ones that you need to include in full, and ones that, are just excerpts?
Yeah. Answer. It might sound almost Trumpy, but I think of an anthology as real estate. There's X amount of acres or of square feet that you can fill in, and an anthology creates its own double. It's the anthology with everything that you put in, and then the anthology with everything that you left out. And the hope is that the first one is better than the anthology with everything that was left out. So there are certain pieces that you can't cut. They are so precious. They are so complete. You need the reader to go through that story of Flannery O'Connor, of the tortured nature of the characters. If you only give one paragraph, you mess it up. That's not Flannery O'Connor. In other places, like a column by Dorothy Day, I mean, I think I ended up including the entire column, but I considered shortening it, or a speech or a sermon that is too long, because that meant that I would be able to include a poem by somebody else, or a short reflection. And so you have to make a kind of intimate hierarchy of what pieces have to appear in full and what pieces can be smaller in order still to be representative of the author that they come from. You finish putting together the book, JG, and you think, oh, did I do well? Did I find that balance? Did I overstep on this particular side or on that particular side? You're always even wrestling with the making of the anthology that wrestles with God.
Just a few more questions if you have a bit more
Of
time.
course.
I wanted to ask you about the role of race in wrestling with God, because you have a lot of civil rights voices in here, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and you also, the Civil War comes into play.
Right.
Can you talk about race as it relates to wrestling with God in this
Yeah.
nation?
Coming from Mexico, an outsider that eventually became an insider, I think race is the defining factor of this country, either we want it or not. Even when we did not acknowledge those people with a different color skin as humans, the question of race was central to our view of things. And that goes for the Civil War, and it goes through to the end of the 19th century. And of course, in the 20th century, this country becomes much more racially and ethnically diverse. And we have every single religious background in this country. This country is a kind of microcosm of the entire world. And every single racial and ethnic background here represented, because we have immigrants from every part of the world. And so the question to me is, does God have a race? Does God have a racial preference? Does God even concern God itself with the question of how we look, the color of our skins, or is it only with our soul, which is supposed to be non-racial and non-ethnic? Very complex questions. Some people have been pushed to denigration just because they have a different color skin. Others become supremacists because of the color skin. I don't think you can talk about religion in America without being honest and frontal about race. They go one and one. And with the question of God, does God have a preference? This administration will say yes, and it's for white people. And I think that the administration of Obama would say God is multiracial, has a different perspective. We are learning to be together depending on how we look and how we believe in God or not.
Do you think it even goes beyond race? What I mean by that is the question of how we wrestle with God as a nation, as a society, as a people. It it seems to actually connect to other things we wrestle with. You know, through this question of how we wrestle with God, we also end up asking questions about how we wrestle with issues like class, our history of imperialism, any number of different subjects end up tying back into the question of how
Yes.
this nation wrestles with God. Can you speak to that?
Yes, of course, because we justify our actions in going to war by saying God wanted us to attack Iran or wanted us in the manifest destiny to take over other lands and expand our view of what the United States, the territory should be. We use God for our benefit and according to our circumstances. And you can't really separate God from the issues of imperialism or the issues of class and who's controlling whom or the color of one's skin. And you will see that even in the depiction of Jesus in different movies, you can have Jesus being whiter or darker skin, or you can have all kinds of nuances in between. I think that this country, as multicultural as it has already become, and it irrevocably will become even more, will always be wrestling with this question of, through religion, looking at all these other aspects that are intricately, inevitably connected with how we perceive ourselves. Maybe ultimately, God is nothing but a mirror in which we see our face distorted or realistic, and how that face changes over time. And I want to add one more dimension here, JG, and that is that to me, ultimately, everything that we're talking about, class and race and foreign policy, money, all comes down also to the issue of language. We have a word. We came up with the word God. We might not like that word, but that word itself provokes in us a certain reaction. And that word can polarize people in different ways. And ultimately, what we do with religion and what we do with everything else is a matter of language, of the words we use to articulate things in a particular way over time, in dialogue with our contemporaries, but in dialogue also with our past and with those that are not yet born, to whom we're sending messages, like a book like this, that at some point will be open 100 years from now, and somebody will say, this is how they looked at God at that time, and now we finally don't need God anymore because blah, 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 or we believe in God more than they did because blah, blah, blah.
The last question I wanted to ask you specifically about the inclusion of the last two authors that cap it off. Will Arbery, who wrote the play Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which I was very touched by that play, even though it's about characters that I don't agree with politically, but I understand their alienation on some level, and I've known Catholics like that. So I thought that was a really interesting inclusion. And Molly McCully Brown, and they're both very young. They were both born either in the late 80s or early 90s. What do you think?
Early 90s.
Right, right. What do you think that those younger voices have to teach us, and what do they say about the evolution of our conversation?
Oh my God, that is so important. The question here is always, where do you draw a line? Where do you say this is the last entry? Is the last entry the one that people have already seen somewhere else because they have been established? I don't know, the Baldwins or the Woody Allens or the Colberts, or are you daring as an editor to go to people that are 30 or 40 years younger than you are? Are you keeping up with how the new generation, distracted maybe by social media, much more impulsive in different ways, is looking at the questions of God? I found Heroes of the Forthcoming a fascinating play. I'm Jewish, as I mentioned at the beginning, so the characters are very different and unlike me, and yet I found an honesty, particularly in that scene of the party where they are all discussing the big issues of God and the end of the world, etc., being done in a play, outside a house. I found it superb, and I found this to be yet another proof that the discussion on God, the wrestling with God goes on. It doesn't stop with the new technology. It doesn't stop with the new scientific discoveries. The younger generation, and Will Arbery could be my son, is proof that we are the younger people looking for any way to explain and express what they go through. And then the last piece of the book was very important to me because it presents a disability, physical disability, as a question of how do I understand God? Why did God send me a body that is fragile? It stumbles. It's frequently in pain. Is this a punishment that I'm getting, or is this a way to exhort me to be better? And I think that is yet another proof of the word that you use, democratizing God. I think God is not only about the healthy and the complete, so to speak, but God is about all the neuroses and all the the disabilities that we all have, no matter how we are perceived by others. And just wrapping this answer to your superb question, it's sobering to me that this big question of how does America wrestle with God started 400 years ago or more, and it continues strong. It continues in a passionate, devoted way with the same kind of extremes of do I believe, do I not believe, will God redeem me from all this, or should I push away from God? And I find the articulation of all this very American. We want others to hear. We want to share it. We don't just hide it as monks and nuns and keep that conversation private and intimate. It's a very performative way of dealing with religion. And we find ways to have a microphone or to have a brush or to have a stage or to have a screen in front of us in order to be able to explain how minute and insignificant or how titanic and everlasting we think we are.
Just two more brief questions. I promise to let you go. I know we've gone over an
The
hour.
questions are really wonderful.
Well, the other reason I mentioned that second to the final piece, the excerpt from Heroes of the Fourth Turning, is it really emphasizes the sense of exhaustion or even despair we can have while wrestling with these questions. And it's interesting because there is a struggle element to that title, A Nation Wrestles with God. How much do you think exhaustion, despair fit into just our wrestling as a nation with not only wrestling with God, but wrestling with ourselves in a way? That's sort of what we're doing.
Yeah. It's good that we're anchoring this conversation in Heroes of the Fourth Turning because it's a very recent one and it's a theatrical one. Theater is unfortunately becoming a casualty of the mass culture, and it's difficult to have really exploratory, genuine, authentic place these days that describe an aspect of the American mind or the American soul in a way that goes beyond commercialism and easy manipulation of tastes of the public. Exhaustion, what a wonderful question. Do we get tired as a nation of asking these questions? Are the young inheriting the tiredness of the old and saying, oh, come on, we can go beyond this. Let's do something else. I think the question at the center of all this, JG, is so central to our existence that we can't put it aside no matter how tired we are, no matter how fed up we are with all this. And because of that play in particular, I have a sense that exhaustion is actually another way of dealing with the act of wrestling, that we have to pay attention to those that came before us and acknowledge their arguments. And even if we're running out of breath, we're still talking about these central questions, old and new.
I guess what I meant, though, was more so I didn't word it too well, but Do you think sometimes the way we wrestle with God, whether it's with some people do it in a very angsty, angry way, a Hitchens, or there can be that sense of exhaustion in Heroes of the Fourth Turning. Do you think it also, the way in which we talk about God, religion, faith, do you think it reflects how we're talking in the moment in the zeitgeist about other
Oh,
issues? Like
yes.
socially speaking, it seems like in angry times, we may actually talk more angrily about religion or faith or God. And in happier
Yes.
times, we may talk differently about God or religion or faith. Does that make sense? Like it's a mirror.
And makes yes, yes, yes. And now I understand the other side of the question that you were asking. Yes, we live at a time of I think viciousness and lack of patience for to listen to others. We live at a time where people scream and shout, and I'll give you proof of this. The use of capital letters, uppercase letters in tweets and in other social media messages has multiplied exponentially, whereas when we started with tweets and other forms of communication, it was lowercase mainly. And the same thing goes for exclamation marks. Whereas in the Bible or in Shakespeare, in the Bible, there's no exclamation marks. And in Shakespeare, there are very few. Today, you see in texts, you see in social media messages, they can have 10 or 15 exclamation marks, as if the person is not only telling us something, but screaming at us. It's emphatically stating it. Yes, I think that the discussion that we're having about God is louder, is less patient, is more, the animosity is palpable. And this is ironic because God is also supposed to be an excuse for contemplation, for silence, for retreat, for catching your breath and being able to find your center again. But few people do that, or at least few people do that in a kind of a performative way. This is a country, I think, that has become much more performative than it was even 50 years ago.
Well,
And
we always live in public now because of social media.
yes, we live in public, and there's a big danger about that. There's very little that is left for us to have for ourselves. Everything has to be articulated. Everything has to be on a microphone. Everything has to be recorded and transcribed. It's dangerous.
In closing, so we start in the book with the Navajo Nation. We end with Molly McCully Brown, a very young voice. What do you think the biggest change is in between all of that? Where do you see something in particular as having changed with how we wrestle with God? What's the big takeaway, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yes. Because I want the reader to answer that question, I will give you my answer as if I was the reader of the book and not the editor. I think that there has been a democratization of God. It's not the property of the priests and the rabbis and the theologians. I think God belongs now to everybody. There has also been a demeaning and kind of a deteriorating presentation of God as the excuse for everything wrong in the world or for everything right in the world. But I think that ultimately what I think the book argues is that the sense of exceptionalism that Americans have, that we are a nation called above all nations to be unique, to have something that will become a model for others, can be very challenging, can be humbling. Are we really that exceptional, or are we just like everybody else?
I wanted to add to that and get your view on this. For me, one of the takeaways I got was that I think the biggest change when it comes to how we talk about God, faith, religion, going through from the beginning of the book, the Navajo Nation, to now is I think we've become more comfortable with ambiguity, doubt, even lived experience over sort of uh, hardcore certainty. Do you think that's one thing that has changed, or am I off base?
No, no, I think you are absolutely on base. Yes, ambiguity is the lay of the land these days, though we're also at a time where our big leaders don't want us to find joy in ambiguity. They want us to have very clear, concise, and manipulative messages because ambiguity gives room to doubt, and doubt can be dangerous. Doubt can lead you into questioning things that are supposed to be sacred truths. I absolutely agree with you. And that is why all this debate is so interesting to me, precisely because of the ambiguity and the contradictions. I love how the voices in the book clash with one another and respect and disrespect one another. Ultimately, are we better off because we're screaming at each other? I don't think so. Are we better off because we are more ambivalent about certain things? I think so. But ambivalence in a world so full of extremes, for some people can be very frightening. They want to have a truth that will make them feel solid and connected and belonging to something. And what this book,
especially in a moment, not to interrupt you, but especially in a moment, this is where I can sort of say that I understand the heroes of the fourth turning. We often feel like I think people today feel like they're drowning in quicksand. Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, called it liquid modernity. You can fall through the sands at any time, and I think
yeah.
that's why some people want certainty back.
Yeah, yeah. I like that image. I think that quicksand is the perfect motif here. Though what always attracts me about that motif of quicksand is that I have never in real life been in a place where I have seen quicksand. It's always in the movies. It's the movies that have perpetuated that concept that you can sink in that quicksand. It's like the number of detectives that appear in television is always far larger than the detectives that I have met in real life. And yet, that's exactly what it is. The feeling that your ground is shaky, that you can sink at any point, and that modernity is about this angst that can take over and erase you altogether. Yeah, it's a very frightening moment. It's a moment where the act and art of reading seem to be pushed to the side. Less people are reading now and thinking committedly, following certain arguments, following certain thoughts. We're very suspicious of higher education. We're very suspicious of people who advocate for complexity or for not a single message. I wanted the book to be that. I hope it finds its audience. I think that God would be happy with ambiguity, but who knows? I might die and go to heaven and find God and says, you got it all wrong. I'm all about one certainty, and it's not you, Ilan.
Well, I want to thank you, Ilan Stavans, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work, and how do you suggest they get the book? I'm hoping they will go to their independent booksellers because I'm a big fan of the indies.
Yeah, go to your independent bookseller, go to independent bookstores in general. The book is available in every bookstore, but the independent ones are the crucial ones here because they are so central for democracy. And my work, I deliberately don't have a webpage. I deliberately don't have social media to be self-promoting. I like to surprise, especially myself, on what is going to come next. And I will leave it at that. At some point, hopefully, the same reader of a previous book will find the next one.
Thank you so much, Ilan Stavans, for coming on Parallax Views.
It has been sheer joy.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.